I brought your dinner, sir.
I'm not hungry.
You look like you need it.
Why do you care?
The most feared man in Seoul had defeated rival bosses, corrupt politicians, and an entire criminal underworld. But he was being quietly destroyed by an empty dinner plate. Nobody could reach him. Nobody dared try. Then a young black maid from Accra picked up the untouched tray, walked straight into the lion's den, and said two words that rewrote everything. They said Kang Min-jae once made a man confess simply by sitting across from him and saying nothing for 45 minutes. No threats, no weapons displayed, just silence, delivered with the particular patience of someone who had genuinely nowhere better to be. The man confessed to 3 separate crimes, 2 of which Kang Min-jae hadn't even been investigating. That was the kind of person he was, the kind whose stillness felt louder than other people's explosions, which made the current situation all the more unnerving for everyone involved. For 23 days, the most feared criminal boss in the Republic of Korea had refused to eat, not reduced his portions, not eaten selectively, refused, completely, with the absolute commitment of a man who had decided that food, like trust, was something he no longer required. The kitchen staff prepared meals anyway, elaborate, expensive, beautifully plated meals, because stopping felt like surrendering, and nobody in that mansion was willing to be the person who officially gave up on Kang Min-jae. That was the kind of thing that followed a person around for the rest of their career or the rest of their life. In this particular household, those two timelines were not always distinct. The doctors had come and gone. 3 of them. The first arrived with clinical confidence and left with considerably less of it, having discovered that recommending a feeding tube to a man who controls half of Seoul's underground economy requires a specific kind of courage he apparently did not possess. The second attempted a psychological approach, which Kang Min-jae engaged with briefly before losing interest mid-sentence in a way that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. The third simply wept, collected his fee, and declined to elaborate when colleagues later asked how the appointment had gone. The guards talked in low voices near the service entrance, the way people talk when they're frightened, but need to maintain the professional appearance of not being frightened. They had followed this man through raids, negotiations, and 2 separate incidents that would never appear in any official record. They had watched him walk into rooms where the atmosphere suggested immediate violence, and walk out again having converted enemies into reluctant allies through nothing but composed eye contact and precisely selected words. They were not men who frightened easily, but a man refusing to eat is a particular kind of terrifying because it suggests he has found something more powerful than the basic animal instinct for survival. It suggests he has made a decision that lives below logic, in a place where reason cannot reach him. The rival factions in Busan had already begun repositioning quietly. Not aggressively. Nobody was stupid enough to move aggressively yet. But the way chess pieces shift when one player's king suddenly looks unprotected. Subtle, preparatory, optimistic. Inside the mansion, the tension had developed its own specific texture. Staff members moved faster than necessary. Guards made eye contact with each other slightly too often. The head of household operations, a precise man named Park Jun-ho, who had managed the property for 11 years and prided himself on anticipating every possible domestic crisis, had run entirely out of protocol. He had consulted 3 separate contingency plans and found that none of them covered the boss has stopped eating, and we cannot determine why, and would prefer not to ask directly. It was into this atmosphere, this specific mixture of dread, helplessness, and performative composure, that Nadia Osei arrived on a Tuesday morning carrying a single rolling suitcase and the expression of a woman who had been promised one thing and was already quietly recalibrating for another. The staffing agency had described the position as residential hospitality management for a private household in the Yongsan district. This was technically accurate in the same way that describing the ocean as a large body of water is technically accurate. True, but missing several details that a reasonable person might consider relevant. Details like the armed men at the gate. The security cameras positioned at angles that suggested the architect had paranoia professionally installed alongside the plumbing. The staff members who moved with the careful energy of people who understood that their performance was being evaluated continuously, and the consequences of a poor review were not limited to a difficult conversation with HR. Nadia noticed all of it within her first 20 minutes. She also noticed the kitchen was magnificent. The floors were genuinely beautiful. and whoever had arranged the East Wing linen closet had done so with a baffling disregard for basic organizational logic that she fixed quietly on her second morning without mentioning it to anyone. She had grown up in Accra, watching her mother run a guest house with the precision of a general and the warmth of someone who genuinely believed that every person who walked through a door deserved to be made comfortable. She had studied hospitality in London among people who treated service as either a temporary embarrassment or an art form, and she had learned quickly which category produced better results. She had arrived in Seoul 6 weeks ago chasing a position that had fallen through, accepted this one because the salary was serious and she had a practical relationship with reality, and had spent her first 4 days learning the geography of the mansion and the behavioral patterns of the people inside it. On the fourth evening, she stood in the kitchen corridor watching three grown men conduct an elaborate silent argument about whose turn it was to carry the untouched dinner tray to the boss's private floor. The argument involved significant eye contact, small defensive gestures, and the kind of creative responsibility avoidance that deserved academic study. The food was getting cold. The doenjang jjigae. She had noticed the chef always prepared it, had asked quietly, and been told it was the one dish the boss had specifically requested before the silence began, was losing the warmth that made it what it was. Nadia picked up the tray. Not heroically, not dramatically. With the practical energy of someone who finds inaction genuinely more uncomfortable than action, and has never fully understood why other people don't feel the same way. The three staff members stared at her with an expression that mixed relief, guilt, and what she could only interpret as the specific concern of people watching someone walk towards something they themselves had wisely avoided. The guard outside the private corridor looked at her, looked at the tray, and then looked at her again with the exhausted expression of a man who had decided that objecting was above his current emotional pay grade. She knocked on the door at the end of the corridor. No answer. She knocked again, softer, not timidly. There is a significant difference between soft and timid, and Nadia had never once in her life been timid, but with the particular gentleness of someone who understands that a closed door is not a wall. She opened it and stepped inside. The room was large and quiet, lit by the ambient glow of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was sitting near the glass. Kang Min-jae, the man whose name made rival organizations restructure their quarterly plans, looking out at Seoul with the expression of someone observing a world he has decided no longer entirely concerns him. He was thinner than the photograph she had seen in the staff briefing folder, the kind of thin that happens quickly and announces itself in the sharpness of a jaw, the new visibility of a collarbone. She walked to the table without asking permission. Asking permission, in her experience, often gave people the opportunity to refuse things they actually needed, and set the tray down with careful hands. He turned his head slowly. Their eyes met across the dim room. Kang Min-jae had eyes that people remembered afterward, usually with mild alarm. Dark, still, and precise. The kind of eyes that seemed to be running calculations slightly faster than the conversation required. Eyes that had looked at a great many people over the years and found most of them, in some fundamental way, predictable. He looked at Nadia. She looked back at him with the calm, direct, completely unperformed concern of someone who saw not a legend or a threat or an organizational crisis, but simply a person who had not eaten in 23 days and therefore needed to eat. "Please eat," she said. "Your health matters more than you think." The silence that followed was long enough that the guards outside, listening, despite themselves, had already mentally composed their reports about another failed attempt. Kang Min-jae looked at the tray. He looked at the doenjang jjigae, still faintly steaming, smelling of something that lived so far below conscious memory it bypassed thought entirely and arrived directly in the chest. He looked at her once more, and he reached for the spoon. One bite, then another. Then the quiet, steady rhythm of a man eating an entire meal for the first time in 23 days, while outside the door, grown men who had followed him through extraordinary darkness stood very still and tried to understand what they were hearing. Nadia waited until he had finished, collected the tray, said good night with the same practical warmth with which she had said everything else. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard, barely above a whisper, two words follow her through the closed door. "Thank you." She kept walking, but she smiled, privately, briefly, the way her mother used to smile when the work was done and done well, and the person on the other side of it didn't yet understand how much they had needed it. Neither of them knew yet what they had just started. But in the Pusan faction's headquarters, a phone was ringing, and the man who answered it was very interested to hear that Kang Min-jae had finally eaten, and even more interested to hear who had fed him. The days that followed moved with the quiet rhythm of something inevitable, pretending to be ordinary. Nadia did not change her routine. She rose at 6, completed her assigned duties with the unhurried efficiency that had already earned her a reputation among the staff as either remarkably professional or remarkably oblivious. Opinions differed depending on who you asked and how much they themselves were frightened. She cleaned the West Wing on Mondays and Thursdays. She managed the linen inventory on Wednesdays. She coordinated with the kitchen on meal timing with the organized precision of someone who believed that logistics, properly handled, was its own form of kindness. And every evening, she carried the dinner tray to the private corridor on the upper floor. Nobody asked her to. Nobody assigned it. It simply became, through the quiet logic of repeated action, her responsibility. The way certain tasks attach themselves to the one person willing to do them without performing the doing. The 3 staff members who had previously conducted their silent corridor arguments about whose turn it was now experienced what could only be described as profound professional relief and had the decency not to discuss it openly. Kang Min-jae ate every evening. Everything on the tray. The household noticed because a household of that size, with that many people managing that much controlled tension, notices everything. Park Jun-ho, the head of household operations, updated his personal crisis ledger, a leather-bound notebook he had carried for 11 years that contained observations he shared with absolutely no one, with a single careful entry. Situation stabilizing. Unknown variable. New staff, East Wing. Monitor. Park Jun-ho was, by nature and profession, a man who monitored things. What he observed over the following 2 weeks was this. Kang Min-jae began, incrementally and without announcement, to re-engage with the world. He answered his morning briefings again. Not enthusiastically, but present, sharp, asking the kind of questions that reminded his senior staff why replacing him had always been a theoretical exercise rather than a practical one. He walked the property grounds twice, which the guards received with the quiet relief of people watching a vital machine restart after a terrifying silence. He ate 3 full meals daily, which the kitchen staff treated as something approaching a miracle and celebrated privately with the subdued joy of professionals who understood that their continued employment was nutritionally dependent on his recovery. He did not, however, explain himself to anyone. Kang Min-jae had never been in the habit of explaining himself. Explanation, in his experience, was a form of vulnerability that people stored and retrieved at inconvenient moments. He made decisions, enacted them, and allowed results to serve as their own justification. This had served him extraordinarily well for 20 years, and he saw no compelling reason to revise the approach simply because he had recently experienced an episode of existential collapse that his entire organization had watched with their hearts in their throats. What he did do, quietly, without ceremony, and with the particular care of a man who has decided that a thing matters without being entirely comfortable admitting why, was pay attention. He noticed that Nadia arrived at the same minute each evening, a consistency that appealed to some deep organizational preference in his character. He noticed that she never spoke first beyond the necessary greeting, which he respected immensely in a world populated by people who filled silence with noise because silence made them nervous. He noticed that she arranged the tray slightly differently each evening. Small variations, a different placement of the soup, a folded napkin positioned with geometric precision, and that these small variations suggested a person who was paying attention to what she was doing rather than simply repeating it. He noticed, on the 9th evening, that she had added a small sprig of chrysanthemum in a narrow glass beside the tray. He did not comment on it, but he did not remove it either. On the 11th evening, he spoke before she turned to leave. "You're not Korean," he said. This was, objectively, a statement of extraordinary obviousness, delivered with the tone of a man who was using it as a door rather than a declaration. Nadia turned. "No," she said, with the patience of someone willing to walk through whatever door was being offered. "Ghanaian. I grew up in Accra." He considered this. "Your Korean is functional. I've been here 6 weeks. I'm a fast learner." Something in his expression shifted, barely, the way expensive machinery makes small adjustments that only a trained eye would catch. "Why Seoul?" "An opportunity," she said. It pivoted. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, It was what a smile looks like when it has been out of practice for long enough that the muscles have developed a slight reluctance. But it was something. It was the first something she had seen from him that existed outside the category of controlled, purposeful expression. Pivoted, he repeated, as though the word amused him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The staffing agency was optimistic with their job description, she said. I've made my peace with it. He looked at her for a moment with those calculating, still eyes. Most people find this household difficult. Most people find most things difficult, Nadia said. That's not always the household's fault. He said nothing for a beat. Then, sit down. She blinked. Once, briefly. Then she sat, with the composure of a woman who had decided that unusual invitations, when they came from a place of genuine human need rather than threat, deserved a genuine human response. They talked for 40 minutes. About Accra. About the logic of hospitality, which he approached with the focused interest of a man who understood systems and recognized when he was encountering a sophisticated one. About Seoul's food, which she had developed strong opinions about with admirable speed. About nothing dangerous, nothing revealing, nothing that crossed the invisible boundary both of them recognized without discussing. When she stood to leave, the conversation folded away cleanly, as though it had occurred inside its own separate room. Tomorrow, he said. It was not a question. Tomorrow, she confirmed. Outside in the corridor, the guard who had been stationed there for the past hour and a half was staring at the wall with the expression of a man who had heard things he was professionally uncertain how to categorize. He would later report to Park Joon-ho with careful neutrality that the boss had engaged in an extended conversation with the new household staff member and had appeared, by all observable measures, to be something that resembled content. Park Joon-ho wrote 3 words in his leather notebook: monitor more carefully. In Busan, the rival faction's intelligence officer received his weekly update and noted with considerable interest that Kang Min-jae had resumed normal operations. He noted with even greater interest the footnote his source had included almost as an afterthought. Something about a new member of household staff, a foreign woman, young, and the apparently inexplicable fact that she was the only person who had been able to reach him. The intelligence officer underlined the footnote. Then he picked up his phone. There is a specific kind of danger that announces itself not with violence or noise, but with the quiet, targeted interest of people who have identified something valuable to someone they wish to destroy. It moves slowly. It plans carefully. It waits. It had just started waiting. And in the mansion above Seoul's glittering, indifferent skyline, Nadia Ose walked back to the East Wing thinking about chrysanthemums in the particular way a powerful man's face looks when it remembers briefly that it is allowed to be human. She did not yet know she had been noticed by the wrong people. She did not yet know that the warmth she had brought back into that room had also, simultaneously, painted a target on everything she was. But the city below kept moving, the way cities do, bright and loud, and entirely unconcerned with the small, quiet moments that change everything. The chrysanthemum lasted 4 days. Nadia replaced it on the 5th without comment, and Kang Min-jae noticed the replacement the way he noticed everything, completely, quietly, and without revealing that he had noticed at all. This was a skill he had developed over 20 years of operating in environments where showing your attention was the same as showing your hand. In boardrooms and back alleys alike, the man who appeared to be paying the least attention was almost always paying the most. He was paying a great deal of attention to Nadia Ose, not in the manner his staff had begun whispering about in the lower corridors, those whispers being the specific, slightly scandalized variety that spreads through a closed household the way weather spreads through a valley, filling every available space with its own particular atmosphere. The whispering bothered him less than the inaccuracy of it. What he felt when Nadia entered the room was not what the whispers implied. It was something quieter and considerably more inconvenient than that. It was recognition. The specific, unsettling recognition of encountering a person who operates by a set of internal principles so genuinely their own that no external pressure has managed to reshape them. He had met very few such people in his life. He had, in fact, spent most of his adult life surrounded by the opposite, people whose principles were flexible, negotiable, and available for revision depending on who was asking and what was being offered. Seo Hyun-woo had been one of those people. For 14 months, Kang Min-jae closed that thought the way he closed all thoughts that led in that direction, firmly. efficiently, without ceremony, and returned his attention to the morning briefing. His senior staff, assembled around the long conference table on the second floor, had the carefully composed expressions of people who were deeply relieved their employer had returned to functional capacity and were determined not to say anything that might reverse the progress. They presented figures, updates, territorial intelligence, and pending negotiations with the focused energy of men who understood that the standard of performance expected in this room had not decreased, simply because the man receiving their reports had recently experienced a personal crisis. If anything, the standard had clarified. He listened. He asked questions. He made 3 decisions before the coffee was finished, each one precise enough that his operations chief, a compact and serious man named Lee Dong-hyun, made notes with the specific speed of someone trying to capture lightning before it moved on. By 11, the morning's business was concluded. By 11:15, Park Jun-ho had appeared in the doorway with his leather notebook and his expression of controlled administrative concern. The East Wing staff rotation, Park Jun-ho began, with the careful tone of a man navigating a conversation he had rehearsed. I wanted to discuss the scheduling for... She stays on evening meal service, Kang Min-jae said without looking up from the document he was reviewing. Park Jun-ho paused. I hadn't specified which staff member. I know what you were going to suggest. He turned a page. She stays. Park Jun-ho wrote something in his notebook, nodded with the professional composure of a man who had learned 11 years ago that certain decisions were above his authorization level, and withdrew. What Park Jun-ho wrote was, direct intervention, confirmed attachment, escalate monitoring protocol. What he did not write, because some observations existed below the level of professional documentation, was that he had never in 11 years heard Kang Min-jae make a staffing decision based on anything other than operational efficiency, and that this particular decision had been made before the relevant question was fully formed. Nadia, at that precise moment, was in the kitchen having an argument about ginger, not a heated argument. Nadia did not do heated arguments, finding them inefficient and acoustically unpleasant, but a firm and organized disagreement with the head chef, a meticulous man named Cho Sung-min, who had trained in 3 countries and had opinions about ingredient ratios that he defended with the passion of someone who considered compromise a form of culinary violence. The doenjang jjigae needs more ginger, Nadia said. Not much, a small adjustment. Cho Sung-min looked at her with the expression of a man being told by a newcomer how to conjugate his native language. I have been making this dish for... He's eating it every evening and he always slows down at the same point in the bowl, Nadia said. Same point, same pause, same expression. Something isn't quite reaching him. The base is perfect. I think it's the ginger. Cho Sung-min stared at her. I grew up watching my mother adjust recipes based on who was eating them, she continued. Not what the recipe required. Who needed it? They're different things. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Cho Sung-min, who was a proud man but also an honest one, picked up a piece of fresh ginger and said nothing further, which was, in the particular language of professional kitchens, a form of agreement. That evening, Nadia carried the adjusted doenjang jjigae to the upper floor. Kang Min-jae ate it in silence, as always. But at the point in the bowl where he usually paused, he didn't pause. He continued. Finished the soup completely before touching anything else on the tray. He looked up. Different, he said. Better or worse? She asked, with the practical directness of someone who needed actual information rather than polite deflection. He considered it with genuine seriousness, the way he considered everything. It tastes closer to something. She understood immediately what he meant. Not better than the previous version. Closer to a memory. Closer to a small Mapo apartment on a Sunday morning, and a woman who placed a bowl with both hands and said the world is easier to carry on a full stomach. Good, she said simply. They sat in the particular comfortable silence that had developed between them over 3 weeks. The kind of silence that 2 people only arrive at when they have tacitly agreed that neither of them requires noise in order to feel that a connection is real. It was the silence of people who communicate more in what they don't say than in what they do, which is either a sign of profound compatibility or a significant communication problem. And the difference between the two is not always immediately apparent. Tell me about your mother, he said. The question arrived without preamble, which was characteristic of him. He asked questions the way other people made decisions, directly, without the social scaffolding most people used to make directness feel less confrontational. Nadia looked at him for a moment. Then she told him about the guest house in Accra, about a woman who ran it with military logistics and maternal warmth in equal measure, about learning that service, done with genuine intention, was not a subordinate act, but a generous one. He listened the way he did everything else, completely, without interruption, without the performative nodding that most people use to signal attention while actually constructing their own response. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone who understood something most people don't," he said. "She did," Nadia agreed. "She said that feeding someone is an act of trust. You're saying, 'I believe you deserve to keep going.'" The room held that sentence for a moment. Kang Min-jae looked at the empty bowl. Then he looked at Nadia with an expression that was not quite readable. Or rather, it was readable, but only if you were paying the specific kind of attention that most people in his life had never bothered to pay, being too occupied with fearing him to see him. He looked like a man who had just been handed something he didn't know he had lost. 4 floors below, in the staff security office, a junior guard named Woo Sung-jae was reviewing the day's external communications log and finding, in the unremarkable scroll of routine data, something that was not routine at all. A signal, repeated, coordinated, coming from outside the mansion's network perimeter and pinging, with the patient persistence of something being operated by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, against the household's internal staff registry. Someone was looking for a specific person. The profile parameters in the search were narrow: female, foreign national, recently employed, East Wing. Woo Sung-jae stared at his screen for a long moment. Then he picked up his radio, thought carefully about who to call, and made a decision that would, though he did not know it yet, determine the direction of everything that followed. He called Park Jun-ho, and Park Jun-ho, reading the information delivered in a careful, low voice, wrote 4 words in his leather notebook in letters slightly larger than his usual precise script. "She is the target." Park Jun-ho did not sleep that night. This was not unusual for a man whose professional existence consisted largely of anticipating catastrophes before they fully assembled themselves. But this particular sleeplessness had a different quality to it. It was not the sleeplessness of logistical concern. It was the sleeplessness of a man sitting with information that was dangerous in every direction. Dangerous to share, dangerous to withhold, and most dangerous of all, to mishandle. He sat at his desk in the small administrative office adjacent to the main security hub and read Woo Sung-jae's report 3 times. Then he closed the file, placed both hands flat on the desk, and stared at the wall with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that keeps producing answers he doesn't want. The search had originated from a server registered to a logistics company in Incheon. The logistics company, upon 30 minutes of careful background investigation by the mansion's head of security, a former intelligence officer named Baek Sung-il, who approached information the way surgeons approach incisions, precisely and without sentiment, turned out to be a shell. Behind the shell was another shell. Behind that was a financial trail that led, with the inevitable logic of a river finding the sea, directly to the Pusan faction. Park Jun-ho was not surprised. He was, however, extremely concerned. The Pusan faction had been quiet since Se-hyun-woo's removal. Too quiet, in retrospect. The specific quiet of people who had decided that patience was their most effective remaining weapon. They had lost their intelligence source inside the mansion. They had watched Kang Min-jae's apparent decline with optimistic interest. They had begun repositioning their assets with the careful ambition of people who believed the throne was becoming available. And then Kang Min-jae had started eating again. Worse, from the Pusan faction's perspective, he had started thinking again, operating again. The morning briefings had resumed their former sharpness. 3 pending negotiations that had stalled during his withdrawal were moving forward with renewed momentum. The organizational anxiety that had settled over the entire network like a low-pressure system was lifting. Their window was closing, and someone in Busan had been smart enough to identify the reason why. Park Jun-ho picked up his pen. The question that kept the pen suspended above the notebook, unmoving for a full 2 minutes, was not whether to tell Kang Min-jae. That decision was straightforward. The man ran the organization with the expectation of complete information, and delivering incomplete information to him was a form of professional self-destruction that Park Jun-ho had no interest in pursuing. The question was how to tell him, and more specifically, when? Because Kang Min-jae, in Park Jun-ho's 11 years of careful observation, had never once in his life made a decision influenced by personal feeling. He was a man of extraordinary discipline, who had constructed his decision-making process like a fortress, fortified against sentiment, against impulse, against the specific vulnerability of caring about outcomes for personal rather than strategic reasons. What Park Joon-ho had observed over the past 3 weeks constituted, in his professional assessment, a meaningful structural change in that fortress, and he was deeply uncertain how the man inside it would respond to the news that the change had been noticed by enemies. He wrote 3 words: "Morning, tell him." Nadia woke at 6, as always, and spent approximately 4 minutes staring at the ceiling of her small East Wing room before the day's practical requirements assembled themselves in her mind with sufficient force to motivate movement. She had always been a morning person in the specific sense of someone who does not enjoy mornings but has made a disciplined peace with their necessity. She showered, dressed, and was halfway through organizing her task list for the day when she noticed, with the particular attentiveness of someone trained to observe household environments, that the atmosphere of the mansion was different this morning. Not dramatically different, not the obvious, visible tension of a crisis in progress. Something subtler, the specific quality of air in a building where people know something and are carrying the knowledge carefully, the way you carry something fragile, with both hands and reduced speed. The guard at the East Wing entrance made eye contact with her for slightly too long when she passed. The kitchen assistant, who usually offered her morning coffee with cheerful efficiency, was quiet and focused on his work. Park Joon-ho, whom she passed in the second-floor corridor, gave her a look she couldn't fully interpret, something between assessment and apology, before continuing to his destination with his leather notebook held close. Nadia filed all of this into the section of her mind she reserved for things she didn't yet have enough information to act on, and continued with her morning. She was inventorying the West Wing supply closet at 9:47 when Lee Dong-hyun, Kang Min-jae's operations chief, appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man delivering a message he had been given precise instructions about. "He'd like to see you," Lee Dong-hyun said. "Now, if you're available." The "if you're available" was a grammatical formality that both of them understood was not actually a question. The study on the third floor was a room Nadia had cleaned but never occupied. It was large, lined with books that had clearly been read rather than displayed, and organized with the same precise logic that characterized every space Kang Min-jae actually inhabited. He was standing at the window when she entered, not sitting, which she noted, because a man who chooses to stand for a difficult conversation is positioning himself differently than one who sits. Standing said, "I am prepared to move in whatever direction this requires." He turned when she came in. His face was composed, controlled, the expression she had come to recognize as his working face, the one he wore when he was managing something internally that he did not intend to allow externally. "Sit down," he said. She sat and waited, with the patience of a woman who had learned that rushing a person toward difficult words only produces worse versions of them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Someone is looking for you." Nadia held very still. "The Pusan faction," he continued, "has identified you as a point of significance within this household. They've been running external searches against the staff registry. Your profile matches their search parameters." He paused. "They know you're the reason I resumed normal function." The room was very quiet. "They intend to use that," he said. "I don't yet know specifically how, but the intention is clear." Nadia looked at him steadily, processing, not panicking. Panic, in her experience, was what happened when you allowed the worst version of a situation to occupy the entire available space in your mind. She was making room for information alongside the fear, which is the only arrangement that produces useful responses. "What are my options?" she asked. Something moved through his expression. It was brief and quickly managed, but she saw it. The specific response of a man who had prepared himself for many possible reactions to this information and had not entirely prepared for that one, for the directness of it, for the complete absence of helpless distress. "You could leave," he said. "The organization would arrange travel, safe passage, a new position arranged somewhere you'd be difficult to locate. And the other option?" He looked at her. "You stay, under full protection, operational security, personal detail, everything this organization is capable of providing." A pause, which is considerable. "But staying makes me part of whatever is happening between you and Pusan." "You're already part of it," he said, with the specific honesty of a man who believes that softening true things is a form of disrespect. I'm offering you the choice of how. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Seoul moved through its morning with magnificent indifference. Traffic and commerce and 10 million lives progressing on their own trajectories, entirely unconcerned with the conversation taking place in this particular room on this particular floor. Can I ask you something? She said. He nodded. If I leave, if I'm safe somewhere else, what happens to you? The question landed in the room with a weight that neither of them had anticipated. It was not a strategic question. It was not a negotiating position. It was the question of someone who had spent 3 weeks carrying dinner trays to a man who had forgotten he was allowed to be hungry and had developed, through that repetition, a genuine and inconvenient investment in his continued survival. Kang Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, I go back to being the man I was before you knocked on that door. The room held that sentence. Nadia nodded slowly, not in agreement, in understanding. In the specific recognition of a woman who had just received the most honest answer a man like this was capable of producing, and understood exactly what it had cost him to produce it. Then I'm staying, she said. The protection detail assigned to Nadia was so discreet that she only identified 3 of the 5 members within the first 24 hours. She identified the 4th on the second day, a quiet woman named Ji-soo, who had been reassigned from external security and whose casual positioning near the East Wing entrance was slightly too consistent to be accidental. The 5th took her until the 3rd morning, when she noticed that the new kitchen delivery coordinator who had appeared without introduction moved through the building with the specific, practiced economy of someone whose primary training had nothing to do with kitchen deliveries. She did not mention any of this to anyone. But at dinner on the 3rd evening, when she set the tray down and Kang Min-jae looked up, she said, Your 5th person is very good. I almost missed him. Kang Min-jae looked at her with an expression that was doing significant work to remain neutral. Most people wouldn't have found any of them. I grew up in a guest house, she said, sitting down in what had become, without formal designation, her chair. You learn to notice who belongs in a space and who is present in it for a different reason. They're different body languages. He considered this. What's the difference? People who belong somewhere move through it. People assigned to somewhere watch it. He was quiet for a moment. You'd have made a reasonable intelligence operative. I make a better hospitality manager, she said. Fewer ethical complications. The corner of his mouth performed its small, reluctant movement. She had started privately cataloging these, the almost smiles, the micro-expressions that passed across his face like weather systems moving through a controlled climate. They were becoming more frequent. She had filed this observation under things I noticed but have not decided what to do with. The evening conversation had evolved, over the weeks, into something that had its own internal structure. They began with the practical, the food, the day's events, the small observations that formed the texture of daily life. Then they moved, gradually and without announcement, into deeper water. He asked questions with the directness of a man who had never learned to approach what he wanted to know indirectly, and she answered with the honesty of a woman who found evasion intellectually unsatisfying. Tonight, however, there was something underneath the conversation, a current, the awareness, present in both of them and unaddressed by either, that the world outside the room had reorganized itself around them in ways that were accelerating. Lee Dong-hyun had briefed Kang Min-jae that morning with intelligence that had arrived through 3 separate channels, all pointing in the same direction. The Busan faction was not simply monitoring. They were moving, asset repositioning, increased communication between their Seoul-based contacts and their central operation. The specific pattern Baek Sung-il had noted in his assessment of people who have identified a moment and are preparing to act inside it. The moment they had identified was Nadia. Not as a target for direct action. That would be too obvious, too easily traced, and would produce a response from Kang Min-jae that nobody in their right mind wanted to provoke. Something more surgical, more strategic. The Busan faction had always preferred pressure to confrontation, the slow application of leverage rather than the blunt delivery of force. They had learned this at considerable cost from watching Kang Min-jae operate for a decade. What they had identified was not a weakness in his security, it was a weakness in his armor. And they had found it because he had, for the first time in 20 years, developed one. Kang Min-jae had not shared the specifics of the morning briefing with Nadia. He had told himself this was operational prudence, that information shared unnecessarily created unnecessary variables. He was aware, with the uncomfortable self-knowledge of an intelligent man, that this reasoning was approximately 60% genuine and 40% something else entirely, something that resembled the instinct to carry a problem alone rather than transfer its weight to someone who had not signed up for the carrying. Nadia, for her part, had spent the day moving through her duties with outward normalcy, while internally processing the architecture of her situation with the methodical clarity she brought to every complex problem. She was not afraid precisely. She was alert, the specific heightened alertness of someone whose environment has recalibrated its level of danger and whose nervous system has adjusted accordingly, like an instrument retuned to a different key. What she was less prepared for, less equipped to process with methodical clarity, was what happened at the end of the evening. She had stood to collect the tray. He had stood at the same moment, for no apparent operational reason. They were briefly occupying the same small geography of the room, closer than the usual distance of the dinner table, closer than the arrangement of the conversation usually required. And for a moment, neither of them moved. He was looking at her with the undisguised attention of a man who had stopped, in that specific instant, managing what his face was doing. All the careful architecture of controlled expression had stepped aside, and what was underneath it was something unambiguous and undefended. Nadia looked back at him. The tray was between them, which was, she would later reflect, probably useful. "You should know," he said quietly, "that I am not a man who makes things easy." "I hadn't assumed otherwise," she said. "The life I have built." He paused, reconsidered, rebuilt the sentence from a different starting point. "There are things about what I am and what I have done that exist very far outside the reach of what you deserve to be near." "You're warning me," she said. "I'm being honest with you." "Those aren't always different things," she agreed. "But sometimes a warning is also a door, depending on which side of it you're standing." He looked at her for a long moment. "Which side are you on?" he asked. It was the most unguarded question she had ever heard from him, stripped of strategy, stripped of management, stripped of the 20-year habit of asking nothing that might reveal the importance of the answer. Nadia set the tray back down on the table. "I'm the one who keeps coming back with dinner," she said. "You tell me." The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul glittered and hummed and conducted its vast, indifferent business. Inside the mansion's carefully monitored perimeters, 5 protection detail members were stationed at various points, each of them professionally occupied with the external threat landscape. None of them were watching the third-floor study, which is why none of them saw Kang Min-jae, the man whose composure was so legendary that his own staff had stopped expecting cracks in it, reach across the space between them and take Nadia's hand with the careful deliberateness of someone doing something they have thought about for a long time and have finally decided they're done not doing. She didn't move away. She looked down at their hands. His, large and marked with the particular history of a life lived at considerable intensity. Hers, steady and warm and present. And then looked up at him. "This is the part," she said quietly, "where things get complicated." "They were already complicated," he said. "More complicated then." "Yes?" She nodded. "All right." It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was something more honest than either. An acknowledgement between two people who communicated best in precise language that something real was happening and that both of them had decided, with full awareness of the cost, to let it. 3 floors below, Park Jun-ho's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Baek Sung-il. 4 words. "They're moving. This week." Park Jun-ho stood from his desk, picked up his leather notebook, and moved toward the stairs with the specific urgency of a man who understood that the window between warning and too late was not a large one. Above him, 2 people sat in a room full of quiet, holding something new and fragile and genuine in a building that was, without their knowledge, already surrounded by the intention to take it from them. The message arrived at 3 in the morning, not through any of the mansion's official communication channels, not the encrypted network, not the secured internal line, not any of the 17 monitored pathways that Baek Sung-il's security infrastructure maintained with the obsessive thoroughness of a man who had spent a career learning exactly how information moved when people didn't want it traced. It arrived the old way. Paper, slipped beneath the main gate by someone who had approached on foot avoided every camera with practiced precision, and disappeared back into Seoul's pre-dawn darkness without leaving a single recoverable detail. The guard who found it brought it to Baek Sung-il. Baek Sung-il read it once, set it flat on his desk, and called Kang Min-jae at 3:14 in the morning with the calm of a man delivering information he has already emotionally processed on your behalf. Kang Min-jae was already awake. He had been awake since 2, sitting with the specific sleeplessness of a man whose mind had decided that the night's quiet was an appropriate time to conduct a full inventory of every decision that had led him to the current moment. He answered on the first ring. "Read it," he said. Baek Sung-il read it. The message was short. 14 words. 14 words that were designed, and Kang Min-jae recognized this immediately with the cold clarity of a man who had written similar messages himself in earlier years, to accomplish two things simultaneously. The first was to demonstrate capability. The second was to manufacture a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Send the woman away by Friday, or we send her away for you. Permanently. Kang Min-jae was quiet for 4 seconds. "Get Lee Dong-hyun and Baek in the conference room," he said. 20 minutes. He dressed in the dark with the economical efficiency of someone who had conducted pre-dawn emergency meetings often enough that the process required no conscious thought. His mind was already elsewhere, moving through the architecture of the problem the way it moved through every problem, disassembling it into its components, examining each one, looking for the leverage point that the other party had overlooked. There was always a leverage point. Every position, regardless of how secure it appeared, contained within its own construction the specific weakness that patient intelligence could find. This was not pessimism. It was engineering. The Busan faction had made a calculation. Their calculation was that Kang Min-jae's feeling for Nadia would override his strategic instincts, that he would, for the first time in his career, allow personal investment to determine operational response, that he would either send her away, which removed the thing that had restored him and created a psychological wound the faction could exploit in the resulting vulnerability, or refuse to send her away and spend his energy on her protection rather than the counteroffensive, effectively doing their strategic work for them. It was, he acknowledged with cold professional appreciation, a competent calculation. It was also wrong, because it was built on an incomplete model of who he was, a model that assumed his feeling for Nadia was a vulnerability rather than what it actually was, which was, he had determined somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. The first, genuinely clarifying thing that had happened to him in years. Nadia found out at 6:30. Not from Kang Min-jae. He had given specific instructions that she was not to be woken, a decision that was simultaneously protective and that she would, he was fully aware, have strong feelings about when she discovered it. She found out from Ji-soo, her detail member, who made the tactical error of looking at her with an expression of sympathetic concern when they passed in the East Wing corridor. Nadia stopped walking. "What happened?" she said. Ji-soo, to her credit, lasted approximately 3 seconds before concluding that attempting to withhold information from this particular woman was an enterprise with a low success ceiling. By 6:45, Nadia was on the 3rd floor. The conference room meeting had concluded. Lee Dong-hyun and Baek Sung-il had dispersed to execute the first phase of whatever Kang Min-jae had decided. She did not yet know what, and he was alone in the study, standing at the window in the early morning light with a cup of tea going cold in his hand. She walked in without knocking. He turned, saw her face, had the grace not to look surprised. "You should have told me last night," she said. Her voice was even, controlled. The specific control of a woman who is genuinely angry and has decided to be precise about it rather than loud. "You needed to sleep. That was my decision to make." He set the tea down. "Yes," he said. "It was. I made it for you. That was wrong." The directness of the concession, no qualification, no strategic reframing, just the flat acknowledgement of error, took some of the immediate heat out of the room. Not all of it, but enough. "What did they say?" she asked. He told her. All 14 words. She received them without flinching. Stood with them for a moment, the way she stood with everything difficult. Not pushing it away, not collapsing into it, but holding it at the exact distance required to see it clearly. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What I should have done 3 weeks ago," he said. "End it." She looked at him carefully. "End it how?" The Busan faction has been operating on borrowed time since Seo Hyun-woo. They used him to build intelligence against me for 14 months. What they don't know is that I spent the last 3 weeks, while everyone believed I was simply recovering, building intelligence against them. A pause. I wasn't only eating dinner, Nadia. I was working. She stared at him. The withdrawal gave me something I hadn't had in years, he said. Invisibility. Nobody, including Busan, was watching what I was doing because everyone was too busy worrying about whether I was capable of doing anything. The almost smile appeared, sharper than usual. It turns out that appearing broken is an extraordinarily effective operational cover. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were never actually broken." "I was," he said. "And then I wasn't. Both things are true." He looked at her directly. "You know which variable changed." The room held that for a moment. "The operation moves tonight," he said. "Coordinated. 3 targets simultaneously. Their sole assets, their financial infrastructure, and the faction leadership in Busan. By morning, there will be nothing left of their organization that constitutes a functional threat. And me? You stay in the secure wing until it's concluded, with Jisoo and 2 others." His voice carried the tone of a man who has made a decision he considers non-negotiable. "This is not a discussion." Nadia looked at him steadily. "You're doing it again. I'm keeping you safe. You're making decisions for me." "In this specific instance," he said, with the careful honesty of a man navigating the precise line between protection and control. "Yes, because this specific instance involves people who have threatened to kill you, and my capacity for rational risk assessment where you are concerned has a documented limitation." He paused. "I am asking you to let me do this one thing. Not because you cannot make your own decisions. Because I cannot be effective tonight if I am afraid for you." The room was very quiet. Nadia looked at him. This complicated, controlled, genuinely extraordinary man who had just admitted, in his precise and armored way, that she mattered to him enough to compromise his operational effectiveness. "One condition?" she said. "Name it." "You come back." He looked at her. Something passed through his expression that was too unguarded and too genuine to belong in the vocabulary of a man like Kang Min-jae. And yet there it was, irrefutably present. "That," he said quietly, "is not a negotiable outcome." The night moved like a controlled detonation, sequential, precise, each component triggering the next with the logic of something that had been engineered rather than improvised. Lee Dong-hyun coordinated the soul assets. Baek Sung-il managed communications. Kang Min-jae himself traveled to Busan with 4 of his most senior people and conducted the conversation that ended the faction's ambitions with the quiet finality of a door being closed from the outside. No excessive violence, no spectacle. Just the application of superior intelligence against an opponent who had made the critical error of underestimating a man simply because he had, for 3 weeks, appeared to be suffering. By 4 in the morning, it was done. By 5, Kang Min-jae was in the back of a car moving through the pre-dawn darkness toward Seoul, toward the mansion, toward the east wing where a woman was either sleeping or, more likely, knowing her, sitting awake with the specific alert patience of someone who had decided to wait regardless of how long it took. He looked out the window at the lightening sky. For the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, he was moving towards something rather than simply away from everything else. He arrived at 5:47 in the morning. Nadia was not sleeping. She was sitting in the chair by the window of the secure wing. Not the chair from the study, not their chair, but a functional armchair that someone had placed there with the practical intention of providing seating rather than the unintentional result of providing a location that now carried the specific weight of 3 weeks of conversation. She had a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago and a book open in her lap that she had not read a single word of since approximately 1 in the morning. She heard the car on the gravel below, heard the doors, heard the particular sequence of sounds that meant the security perimeter was being stood down. Not the sounds of emergency or urgency, but the sounds of conclusion, of things returning to their baseline after being held, for a night, at a different altitude. She was at the door when he came down the corridor. He looked tired. The precise, particular tiredness of someone who has spent a night doing something that required the full deployment of every capability they possess, and has now arrived at the moment when the deployment ends and the body presents its invoice. He was still composed, She suspected he would be composed at the end of the world, standing in the rubble with his expression managed and his hands steady. But underneath the composition, she could see the cost of the night written in the set of his jaw and the weight behind his eyes. He stopped when he saw her. They looked at each other across the corridor. "You're not sleeping," he said. "Accurate observation," she said. "Are you all right?" "It's done," he said. Not an answer to her question, which they both recognized, and which she allowed to stand because it was the answer to the question underneath her question, the one she had actually been sitting awake asking since he left. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." "Your tea went cold," he said, nodding at the cup still in her hand. "I'll make new tea," she said. "Come in." The secure wing's small kitchen was not designed for the kind of domestic intimacy that now occupied it. A man who controlled criminal networks across 3 cities, sitting at a narrow table while a woman from Accra made tea with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything. But rooms, in Nadia's experience, became what the people inside them needed them to be. It was one of the foundational principles of hospitality, and it applied equally whether the room was a 5-star hotel suite or a reinforced safe room with security cameras on every exterior wall. She set the tea in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the cup the way she had noticed he always did, as though warmth were something to be held rather than simply experienced, and was quiet for a moment. "Tell me," she said. He told her. Not everything. There were operational details that existed in a category she had no need to enter, and he knew her well enough by now to understand that she would not ask for what she did not need. But the shape of it. The Pusan faction's leadership had been presented with a complete account of their own intelligence failures, financial vulnerabilities, and the full extent of what Kang Min-jae's organization had assembled against them over 3 weeks of apparently compromised inactivity. They had been given a choice that was, like the choice they had offered him, not really a choice. Dissolution or consequence. They had chosen dissolution. "No one was hurt?" she asked. He looked at her. "No one was hurt." She nodded, absorbed this, filed it in the place where she kept the things about him that complicated the simple version of what he was, the things that made the simple version inadequate and the complicated version the only honest one. "You planned all of it," she said. "During the weeks you weren't eating. The last week of not eating was genuine," he said. "The 3 weeks before that." He paused. "Partially." She stared at him. "The breakdown was real," he said, with the directness of a man who has decided that this particular person deserves the unmanaged version of the truth. "What Se-hyun Woo's betrayal showed me about my life was real. I was not performing that." He looked at the tea. "But I am also, fundamentally, a man who responds to crisis by building something inside it. It's the only way I know how to survive things." "You were grieving and planning simultaneously," she said. "Yes, that's exhausting." "It was," he said, simply, without performance. She looked at him across the small table with the full, direct attention that she had given him from the very first evening. The gaze that had caught him off guard, then and still, she could see, reached something in him that nothing else did. Not because it was soft, because it was completely without agenda. She was not looking at him to calculate, assess, or manage. She was looking at him because she saw him, and seeing him was something she had decided, without drama or declaration, that she valued. "Min-jae," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name without the formal address. It arrived in the room quietly and with enormous weight, the way small things do when they represent large shifts. He looked up. "You don't have to manage this one," she said. "Whatever this is, between us. You don't have to build a strategy around it or run intelligence on it or find the leverage point." She paused. "I'm not Pusan. I'm not a problem to be solved." He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet she had learned to read, not absence, but the specific presence of a man moving through internal territory that he rarely allowed visitors. "I don't know how to do this without a strategy," he said finally. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard from him, which was considerable, because he had been consistently honest with her in ways that clearly cost him something each time. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to be someone different. I'm asking you to trust that this particular thing doesn't require a plan to survive." She paused. "Some things work better when you just let them be what they are." He looked at her. Like doenjang jjigae, he said quietly. She blinked. Then she smiled. The full, genuine, unguarded smile that he had been cataloging with the same careful attention she gave to his almost smiles. Exactly like doenjang jjigae. You don't engineer it. You make it with the right ingredients, with genuine intention, and then you let it be what it is. And it tastes like something, he said. And it tastes like something, she agreed. The kitchen was warm. Outside, Seoul was waking, the city assembling itself for another day with the industrious indifference of a metropolis that does not pause for private moments, no matter how significant. Somewhere in Busan, an organization was in the process of dismantling itself. Somewhere in the mansion, 5 protection detail members were standing down from a night of elevated alert. Park Jun-ho was writing something in his leather notebook. She would later learn it was simply the word resolved, followed by a full stop, the most concise entry in 11 years. Inside the small kitchen, Kang Min-jae set down his tea. He reached across the table, the same deliberate, unhurried reach she remembered from the study. The movement of a man doing something he has decided he is done not doing, and took her hand. I want to learn, he said, how to do this without a strategy, how to let something be what it is. He looked at her steadily. I don't know how yet, but I want to. Nadia turned her hand over and held his properly. That's all it takes to start, she said. He nodded. They sat in the warm kitchen while Seoul woke up around them, holding the new and genuine thing between them with the care of people who understand that the most valuable things are rarely the most armored ones, that sometimes what survives the longest is not what is most defended, but what is most honestly tended. Later that morning, he asked her to stay, not as household staff, not under operational protection, simply to stay in the way that means this place is yours if you want it to be. She told him she would think about it. She had already decided. But some things, she believed, deserved to arrive in their own time, rather than be rushed toward their conclusion by impatience. 3 days later, she told him yes. The chrysanthemum on the dinner tray that evening had company, a small branch of something he had asked the garden staff to find, something native to Ghana that had taken them 2 days to locate in Seoul. He said nothing about it when she noticed it. He didn't need to. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. And the most feared man in Seoul, sitting across the table from the woman who had walked into his silence with a warm bowl and 2 quiet words, allowed his face to do the thing it had been practicing for weeks. He smiled, fully, without reluctance, without the careful architecture of controlled expression standing between what he felt and what he showed. It was, by every available measure, the most dangerous thing he had ever done. And it was the best decision he had ever made. He found the flower from her homeland. She said yes. And somewhere in the ruins of what tried to destroy them, something honest and real survived. Because one woman decided that a cold dinner tray was not her problem and a human being in pain was. If this story reminded you that the smallest act of genuine kindness can reach places that power never could, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe if you believe that love found in the darkest places is always worth the risk. The Busan faction tried to use it against him. Instead, it saved him, and she got to stay.